This video is an introduction to quadratics, and we'll go over the basics of quadratics as well as a few examples. Let's start by defining what quadratics is. Quadratics is simply a unit in math that deals with squared equations, essentially things like y equals x squared. As you can see there, the squared indicates that this is a quadratic equation. Another example would be y equals x squared plus 2. Now let's begin with the most simple quadratic equation, y equals x squared. We'll take this equation and graph it. So let's graph y equals x squared. So 0 squared is 0, 1 squared is 1, 2 squared is 4, and 3 squared is 9. We can also do this for the negative side. So negative 1 squared is 1, negative 2 squared is 4, and negative 4 squared is 9. And as you can see, we make this U shape, and this is called a parabola. So when we are dealing with quadratic equations, whenever we graph any quadratic equation, we always end up with this curve, and this is known as a parabola. Now let's analyze this parabola. Now as you can see, this is a parabola which is graphed from a quadratic equation. Now the tip, or where the parabola curves, is called the vertex. The places where the parabola intersects the x-axis are called roots, or x-intercepts. Now these are the two most important pieces of information that a parabola gives you. One, its vertex, which is its lowest point or where it curves, and two are the x-intercepts, so wherever the parabola intersects with the x-axis. Now parabolas can also be facing downwards, and in this case the vertex very simply is the highest point, or the point where the parabola curves, and the two points that intersect with the x-axis are called x-intercepts, or they can also be called roots. Now all parabolas and quadratic equations follow this basic form, y equals ax squared plus bx plus c. Now as you can see, there is an x squared, an x, and a constant term c. Now in our previous example, y equals x squared, the a value was 1, the b value was 0, and the c value was also 0, and this gave us y equals x squared. So whenever we need to make a quadratic equation, we simply fill a, b, c with a value. So for example, let's say we have y equals 2x squared plus 3x plus 1. This is an example of a quadratic equation because it has an x squared term, an x term, or a c, which is our constant. Now all parabolas must have x squared, which means our a value cannot equal 0. Now when we're given a quadratic equation such as y equals 2x squared plus 3x plus 1, we are required to give the roots or figure out the x-intercepts. And in order for us to do this, let's analyze this parabola. Now as you can see, the x-intercepts lie on the x-axis, and on the x-axis the y equals 0. As you can see in our graph, y equals 0 on these blue points, which means in order for us to figure out the x-intercepts, we simply set y equal to 0. So we're left with 0 equals 2x squared plus 3x plus 1. So the first step to figuring out the x-intercept is to set y equal to 0. Now after that, we factor. So if you haven't watched my factoring video, I suggest that you watch it because it will help you factor this trinomial. Now in order for us to factor, we can use the x method, which simply we take the first and the last term, so 2 and 1, and we multiply them, so that gives us 2. And then we take the middle term, 3, and we place it in the bottom. Now we have 2 and 3. Now we have to come up with two numbers that when multiplied give us 2, the top number, and when added give us 3, the bottom number. And those two numbers are 1 and 2, because 1 times 2 is 2, and 1 plus 2 is 3. Now we divide by 2, which is our a value. So in this case, our a value is 2, so 2x squared. If it was 3, then we would divide by 3, but we divide by 2 here. So now 2 over 2, we can simplify that to 1. Now we're left with 1 over 2 and 1. And with these two, we can simply factor it as 2x plus 1 times x plus 1. So if you had difficulty understanding this, I suggest that you watch my factoring video. Now we have 0 equals 2x plus 1 and x plus 1. So how would we figure out what x equals from here? Well, let's say 2x plus 1 here equaled 0. So what would 0 times x plus 1 equal? Well, it would equal 0. which satisfies this equation. Now let's say x plus 1 equals 0. Then we would have 2x plus 1 times 0, which would equal 0. So in order for us to properly figure out what x is, we simply need to set 2x plus 1 equal to 0 and x plus 1 equal to 0. So we have 2x plus 1 equals 0 or x plus 1 equals 0. Now we simply solve this by rearranging and isolating x. So to rearrange, we subtract both sides by 1, and then we're left with 2x equals negative 1. And then we divide both sides by 2, and we're left with x equals negative 1 over 2. We can do a similar thing with x plus 1. So x plus 1 equals 0. And so we divide both sides by 1, and then we're left with x equals negative 1. So we've arrived at two answers, x equals negative 1 over 2 and x equals negative 1. And these are our answers. Now to check, we can simply take one of our x values and substitute it into the equation. So y equals 2x squared plus 3x plus 1. Instead of writing x, we can write negative 1, which is our x-intercept. And then when we simplify this, so negative 1 squared is 1, times 2 is 2, 3 times negative 1 is negative 3, and then the 1 just comes down. And this gives us y equals 0. So we know for sure that negative 1 is our x-intercept. Now if you want, you can check both of the roots, but for now, we can say that negative 1 and negative 1 over 2 are the roots or the solution of this quadratic equation, y equals 2x squared plus 3x plus 1. This concludes the introduction to quadratics. If you have any questions, you can leave them in the comments below.